Now we're coming back to pensions, and an OECD report on Ireland's pension system today has laid out a potentially catastrophic scenario unless significant action is taken, and taken soon. Stating that almost 1 million Irish workers have no private pension provision, the report proposed a number of sweeping changes. Samantha McConnell is Chief Investment Officer of IFG, and she's part of the expert group that contributed to this OECD report. She's on the line now. Samantha, good evening.
Good evening, Mary.
The report proposes that private sector workers will be obliged, they'll be forced to make pension contributions out of their salary. What is it about the state of our pension industry that makes this necessary, and necessary now?
Well, I think there's a number of, as I would call them, inconvenient truths that the OECD review highlighted. The first one being that the current state and public sector pensions are unsustainable in their current form. The second one was that we're only one of 2 OECD countries out of 34 with no mandatory earnings-related pensions. And because of that, because of the voluntary nature of our private pensions, the coverage ratio is extremely low. Only 4 in 10 workers have a private sector pension. And in fact, that drops even lower if you look at part-time workers, where only 1 in 5 have a private sector pension. So if you add all of that up, and you roll that forward a number of years, people coming to retirement are going to be in a very difficult situation. And effectively what I think the OECD is trying to do is to say, from an Irish government perspective, we need to stop kicking the can down the road. We need to start addressing some of those issues, and some of those issues in the short to medium term.
So for a plan like this to work, do you need to get people into a pension system from a very young age? From what age are you talking about?
Well, certainly when we look at pension coverage, it works best when you get people when they're young, because then the level of savings can be more manageable. For example, if you only start contributing to your pension scheme in your 40s, the level of contributions are astronomical. You'd never be able to afford it. Whereas if you start in your 20s, it becomes much more manageable to put a little away over a long period of time.
So you want people to start as soon as they get their first job?
Basically.
But the idea of, taking more money out of people's pockets at this particular point in time, at the moment, it's politically and economically almost impossible to get people to give something more.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I think what we're certainly saying is that while we would favour a mandatory system, we need to look at bringing it in on a gradual basis. There is no way that we would be suggesting to start this system right now, because, as you say, people are really put pin to the collar at this point in time. But if you look at the Australian experience, back in 1991, when they brought in their mandatory pensions, they were in a very similar economic situation to ourselves. And they started with an extremely low contribution rate. And it took them over 10 years to increase that contribution from 3% to just over 9%. And effectively how they increased the contributions was that it was absorbed through economic growth and salary increases, so that the net effect for any individual was not a reduction in their take-home pay. And that's extremely important, particularly in the current environment. So our view is that ultimately what we should do is take this very comprehensive report, start a discussion, start a dialogue and a debate, and come up with concrete proposals, and be able to implement those proposals when we see the economic situation improving.
Now, they comment on the public sector pensions. So should this mandatory contribution system apply to public sector workers as well as those in the private sector?
Well, I think ultimately what they're saying is that the public sector pension as currently structured is unsustainable. There's a 2.7 billion deficit on the public sector pensions as we stand, and we no longer have the NPRF to fall back on to absorb that deficit. So effectively they come up with 3 key recommendations. One is that there has been reforms already announced with regard to the public sector. They want to see those implemented in a much faster way.
This is in terms of the contributions being made by public sector workers to their pensions.
Correct, exactly. And they want to apply the reforms that are already in place to existing workers. So they talk about applying those reforms to people, say, under the ages of 40 within the public sector system already. And finally, what they say is, well, look, if we are looking at introducing some level of mandatory pensions within the private sector, then that should also be brought into place in the public sector. And that's no bad thing, because one of the things that comes out in the report is the inequality between public and private sector pensions. For example, very simply, a male worker retiring from the public sector will get 35% more retirement income than its private sector counterpart, and it's even more. It's even worse for females, where they would get 42% more retirement income than their private sector counterparts.
How do you advise people as to what they should be striving for in their pension in terms of the income they will have when they finish work?
Well, certainly within the private sector, I think it would be unrealistic to expect a pension of 2/3 of your final salary where you're in a defined contribution environment. What we would recommend people to look for is to strive to look for a replacement income of about 50% of your final salary. Now, depending on where you're at on the earning spectrum,
for middle income workers.
Yeah, well then 50% is where you'd look at. Now, some of that will be contributed obviously by the state pension, and then some of it through private savings. Ultimately, what we look at in DC is it makes sense to join where your employer is making a contribution, because effectively they're putting money away on your behalf.
But in order to arrive at being able to retire on a 50% of your salaried income, and paying 9%, is that the level you need to be paying pension contributions at, and paying them since you were about 25? Will that get you there?
We've looked at somebody who's on, say, a 35% income level, and at 35,000 euros, at 25, you'd need to be putting away 10% of your income.
Okay, so that's and you need to be putting that away for the best part of 40 years.
Yeah, ultimately, you can't expect to retire at the age of 65 and live for another 25, 30 years without putting a lot of money away over a long period of time. I think ultimately here, and again they touched on this in the report, is that the retirement age, while it is increasing to 68, needs to be linked to life expectancy. For example, if you go back to 1970, which is hard to believe, but the retirement age at that point was actually 70.
And people were not living as long as they're living now.
Correct. So I think ultimately what this looks for, which is kind of unfortunate for anybody in their 40s or younger, you're going to have to work for a lot longer than perhaps your parents' generation.
On that happy note, Samantha, thank you very much. Samantha McConnell, Chief Investment Officer of IFG. She was part of the expert group that contributed to that OECD report. We'll talk to Minister Joan Burton a little